The garage lights were still on at 2 in the morning. Portland, October. Cold, enough that the breath of the man crouching beside the old car made small clouds in the fluorescent light. He wasn't supposed to have this car. Nobody was. It had been thrown at him. Literally thrown. In front of a laughing room 3 weeks ago, by a woman who considered it worthless. He'd caught it against his chest and said thank you and walked away without explanation. Now his hands were trembling, not from the cold. He'd been cross-referencing the same photograph for 40 minutes. A line drawing in a technical journal most people had never heard of. A curve, one specific curve. And the piece of metal in front of him traced the exact same radius, if he was right about what he was looking at. And he was rarely wrong about things like this. Then someone had just given away $9 million for a laugh. He turned the page, read the footnote, set the book down, sat very still in the dark. 2 weeks before the financial world noticed, nobody was laughing. 2 weeks before every automotive publication in the country ran the same photograph on their front page, Mr. David Cole. Before the phone calls started coming in from collectors who couldn't believe what they were reading. Before the number 9 million appeared in headlines, next to the name of a man most people in that auction hall had never bothered to learn. 2 weeks before all of that, a room full of very expensive people laughed at Brian Cole, and Brian Cole said thank you. Then he picked up the keys and walked away. That part matters. That part is where the story actually starts. Not the money, not the car, not the 40 years of silence surrounding a machine that had been sitting under a canvas tarp in a corner of a dead man's garage, while the world turned and changed and forgot what it was looking for. The story starts with a man who had every reason to be angry, who had every right to fire back, who had enough knowledge sitting behind those quiet eyes to have dismantled every laughing person in that room without raising his voice above a conversational level, and chose not to. That choice, that single, deliberate, unhurried choice, that is where everything begins. Brian Cole was 42 years old, and he had been invisible for so long that he had almost stopped noticing. Almost. There were still mornings, rare ones, when he caught his reflection in the garage window before the sun came up fully, before the fluorescent lights flickered on and turned everything the color of old receipts, and he would look at himself for just a second longer than necessary, not out of vanity, out of something closer to recognition, a quick inventory. Still here, still upright, still going. Then Gracie's alarm would go off upstairs, that little electronic chirping sound. She had chosen herself from a phone settings menu. She'd spent 45 minutes scrolling through on a Tuesday evening while he made dinner, and Brian would stop looking at his reflection and start making breakfast instead. Gracie was 8 years old. She took scrambled eggs very seriously. The eggs had to be soft, not rubbery, which she described with the authority of a restaurant critic who had been wronged one too many times. She ate them with exactly 2 pieces of toast, buttered all the way to the edges, because unbuttered crust was, in her words, a form of giving up. Brian had learned to take the toast out of the toaster 30 seconds earlier than felt right, so that the butter had time to melt before she sat down. He had learned a lot of small things like that over the past 3 years. The big things he was still figuring out. He'd been a mechanical engineer once. The real kind, Mr. David Cole. Not the kind that sits in an open-plan office and approves other people's designs while eating a salad at their desk. The kind whose name appeared in technical documents that other engineers cited in their own technical documents. The kind that other companies tried to recruit by sending actual human beings to his door rather than automated emails that began with, "We noticed your profile." He had 2 patents before he was 34. He had helped design a suspension system for commercial vehicles that was still being used, quietly and without fanfare, in trucks that moved goods across every major highway in the country. He had walked away from all of it when Ellen got sick. Not immediately. He'd tried to hold both things at once, for longer than was sustainable, longer than was honest, driving between the hospital and the office in a fog that he didn't fully recognize as a fog until much later, because when you're inside something that pervasive, it just feels like the air. He'd sit through engineering reviews and think about what the nurse had said that morning. He'd sit beside Ellen's hospital bed during visiting hours and mentally troubleshoot a torque calibration problem he'd left unfinished on his desk. Ellen had noticed. Of course she had. She was sharper than anyone gave her credit for, and being sick hadn't changed that. One evening in the hospital, she'd taken his hand mid-visit and told him, very gently and without any performance of emotion, that he was allowed to be bad at this. That trying to hold everything together was making him absent even when he was present. That Gracie needed a father who was actually there, not a father who was physically in the room while mentally somewhere else entirely, he'd argued. Not well, Ellen had smiled. The kind of smile she had that made argument feel beside the point. 3 months later, she was gone. The engineering job lasted another 6 weeks after the funeral. Technically, he resigned. Practically, he had already been gone for a long time, and the resignation was just the paperwork catching up with the fact. He sold the condo with the view of the river that he and Ellen had picked together from a real estate listing they'd found on a laptop balanced on her knees on a Sunday morning, and he moved himself and Gracie into a rental house on the east side of Portland, where the walls smelled of the previous tenants' cooking. And the porch light was on a sensor that took longer than expected to respond to movement, which meant that every time he came home after dark, he stood on the porch, in the brief dark, waiting for the world to catch up with him. He leased a garage 2 miles away and started taking in old cars. It wasn't a plan. It was barely a decision. It was more like gravity. Machines had always made sense to him in a way that he'd never quite had language for, even back in the engineering years. There was something clean about the logic of a well-made mechanical system, something that rewarded attention and patience and careful hands in ways that felt reliable, predictable. A carburetor didn't have bad days. A seized brake caliper didn't need you to say the right thing. You found the problem. You fixed the problem. You moved on to the next problem. The work was honest in a way that had become more valuable to him than any of the professional validation he'd spent a decade collecting. The money was not good. It was fine. It covered what needed to be covered, if he was careful about what needed to be covered, and Brian had become very good at knowing the difference between what needed covering and what didn't. Gracie had everything she needed, not everything she might have had in a different version of their life, but everything she actually needed, which Brian was increasingly convinced was a more important distinction than anyone raising children in a comfortable tax bracket was usually forced to consider. He picked her up from school every afternoon at exactly 3:15, not 3:20, not 3:10, 3:15, because that was when the bell rang and that was when she came through the door expecting him to be there, and Brian Cole did not intend to be a man who wasn't there when expected. That was the one schedule he kept with the precision he used to reserve for deadline deliverables. Rain, engine mid-restoration. Kevin Tipton calling about a last-minute hauling job that would have paid well. None of it moved the 3:15 pickup. Kevin Tipton had been Brian's friend for 11 years, which in the accounting of adult male friendship was practically geological. Kevin ran a towing and hauling operation out of a yard on Foster Road, drove a truck that sounded exactly as bad as it looked, and operated on the principle that most problems in life could be addressed through the combination of good coffee, sufficient mechanical leverage, and the willingness to ask stupid questions out loud when other people were too proud to ask them. He was 45 years old and had never once, in 11 years, successfully operated any piece of technology smaller than a riding lawnmower. He texted exclusively in capital letters, and had once called Brian at 11 p.m. to ask what the blinking orange light on his smoke detector meant. Brian valued Kevin more than he could accurately explain, which was probably why they never talked about it. Kevin called on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 3:15 pickup completed. Gracie at the kitchen table doing homework with a bowl of cereal she had requested, and then immediately neglected in favor of a math worksheet. Hargrove Estate, Kevin said. They're doing a big auction Saturday. Whole thing. Furniture, cars, whatever the old man left behind. There's a couple engines in the garage that might be worth looking at. I need someone to ride along in case I need to haul something. You doing anything? Brian was doing nothing Saturday. He was usually doing nothing Saturday evenings, which was different from the mornings, which belonged to Gracie's soccer practice, and the specific ritual of watching 8-year-olds chase a ball with the coordinated chaos of a small natural disaster. "What time?" Brian said. Not a question. The punctuation was just a formality. 7. Cocktail hour thing first. Auctions at 9. Brian looked at Gracie bent over her worksheet, hair falling across her face, the pencil moving in the careful, deliberate way she wrote. Everything, each letter considered. She'd had a neighbor she liked 3 doors down, Mrs. Perkins, who babysat sometimes, and always sent Gracie home with cookies that were unambiguously better than anything Brian could produce. "I'll meet you there," he said. He wore the navy jacket because it was the only one he owned that could plausibly attend a formal event without commentary, and he pressed it the night before with the iron he kept in the hall closet and used approximately 4 times a year. He wasn't trying to fit in. He knew he wouldn't fit in. He'd stopped caring about fitting in somewhere around month 6 of the post-Ellen adjustment, when he'd realized that most of the social energy he'd spent in his career years performing adequacy for audiences he didn't particularly like had been a tax he'd paid voluntarily and could simply stop paying. He wasn't going to the Hargrove estate to impress anyone. He was going to look at engines. The estate announced itself from the road the way only old money did. Iron gates set back from a stone pillar with a discreet address plate. A long driveway lined with Japanese maples that had been there long enough to mean something, their October leaves gone copper and dark against the porch lights. The house itself was visible from the gate as a series of lit windows, stacked and arranged in the particular way that very large old houses arranged themselves when no single room was redundant, when space had been accumulated rather than purchased all at once. Brian drove his truck in after Kevin's flatbed and parked where a valet attendant in a vest directed him with practiced efficiency. The lot was already half full of vehicles that cost more than Brian earned in a year, parked with the casual proximity of things whose owners didn't worry about door dings. Inside, the cocktail hour was exactly what it sounded like and exactly what he'd expected. A large room with 20-foot ceilings and art on the walls that was either very important or trying very hard to look it. Staff moving through the crowd with silver trays, carrying glasses of champagne, and small things on toothpicks that Brian couldn't identify and didn't attempt to. Conversation running in the particular frequency of rooms where everyone present already knows what everyone else does for a living, and the small talk is less about learning anything and more about maintaining a kind of mutual acknowledgement that everyone belongs there. Brian got a glass of water from a bartender at a side table and moved toward the edges of the room the way he always moved through rooms like this. Not nervous, not self-conscious, just accurate. He knew what he was and what he wasn't, and he didn't waste energy performing either. He heard fragments. A conversation about a vacation property in the mountains. Another about a restructuring. 2 men near the window arguing, very politely, about whether a particular golf course had declined since its last renovation, the kind of argument whose stakes existed entirely within the argument itself. Brian drifted through it all like a current moving through water, present and unimpeded and unnoticed, to the people filling this room with their curated conversations, and their tailored jackets and their specific variety of ease that money purchased over generations. He was part of the background, a maintenance worker who had wandered in from the wrong door, maybe. A contractor who hadn't gotten the memo about dress code. Nobody asked. Nobody looked twice. And Brian, who had spent 3 years rebuilding a life in which being unlooked at was actually a form of relief, found that the room's indifference suited him fine. He was there for the machines. And then he found the garage. It was accessible through a set of double doors at the back of the main hall, propped open to allow the more mechanically curious guests to view what the auction house had already catalogued and staged. The contrast with the main room was immediate and complete. Concrete floors. Fluorescent lighting instead of chandeliers. The smell of lubricant and old rubber, and something underneath that was more specific. the particular smell of metal that has been sitting in one place long enough to develop a relationship with the air around it. 6 vehicles were arranged under good lighting, each on a small, raised platform, each with a printed placard describing provenance and estimated value. They were beautiful in the way that well-maintained rare things were beautiful, which is to say their beauty was partly the thing itself, and partly the evidence of how long someone had cared about it. Brian looked at each of them, appreciated them, didn't feel anything in his chest. Then he turned toward the back corner. The thing he noticed first was the absence of a placard. Then the tarp. It was heavy canvas, the gray-green color of old military surplus, and it had been arranged over something, rather than thrown over something. There was care in how it lay, even if the care was old, in the way the fabric draped with intention across contours that it had been adjusted to follow at some point in the distant past, and then left, forgotten by everyone except whoever had placed it there. And from the near edge, where the corner of the tarp had shifted slightly, maybe from the movement of people through the room or the vibration of the exterior doors being propped open, a curve of metal showed itself. A curve, not a line, not the flat plane of a door panel or the straight geometry of a frame rail. A curve with specific proportion, a curve that described a radius Brian's memory turned over and couldn't immediately place, which was strange, because his memory for automotive geometry was the kind of spatial catalog that engineers developed over years of close reading and never fully lost. He walked toward it. He crouched. He looked at it for a very long time without touching anything. The proportions were what kept snagging at him. The relationship between the visible radius and the rate of its transition to the obscured section, extrapolated from what he could see, suggested a body profile that didn't match anything in mainstream production from any decade he could immediately identify. Too deliberate, too specific. The kind of specificity that didn't come from cost-cutting or committee decisions, or the compromise language of commercial manufacturing. This curve had been designed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. His pulse shifted, barely. Just enough that he noticed it. He stood up. Looked around the garage. Nobody had registered his presence in the corner. He looked back at the tarp once, the way you looked at something you already knew you were going to come back to, and walked into the main room. He found the cluster of people near the dessert table, because Kevin was there. Large and obviously comfortable in a room where he also didn't belong but had decided to enjoy rather than endure. Currently explaining something to a man in a very well-tailored suit with the enthusiasm of someone who had found a sympathetic audience, or a captive one. Brian couldn't always tell with Kevin. Someone near Brian asked what he'd been looking at in the garage. A man with the easy conversational warmth of someone practiced at using friendliness as social leverage. Brian answered honestly because he always answered honestly, which was a habit that served him better in some rooms than others. The car under the tarp in the back corner. And then, because the question had seemed genuine. It's not in the catalog, but there's something in the proportions of what's visible that I want to look at more closely. He didn't say anything else. He didn't explain the feeling in his chest, or the way his engineer's mind was running comparisons against a library of obscure, technical literature. He'd spent years accumulating in the odd reading hours he carved out after Gracie was asleep, flipping through dry-voiced historical documents about experimental vehicles and abandoned prototype with the same quiet focus he brought to everything he loved that he couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't already loved it themselves. He just said what he'd seen. And that was when Nicole Hargrove looked over. He heard her before he saw her. Or rather, he registered the shift in the room's attention before he registered her. The way a small group reorients when someone with gravitational pull moves through it. And then there she was, crossing the distance between them, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who never hurried, because the room always waited, champagne glass still in hand, a smile on her face that had the quality of being assembled rather than arrived at. Brian had not known who she was when he walked in. He had not researched the Hargrove family before attending. He'd had no reason to. He was there for engines. But he took her in quickly and accurately, the way he took in everything quickly and accurately. 36 maybe, dressed in the kind of simple that costs a lot, the kind of posture that comes from being looked at since childhood, and deciding early to give people something worth looking at. The surname on the event invitation Kevin had shown him in the truck clicked into place. George Hargrove's daughter. And she was looking at him the way people looked at things they were going to use for something. You actually like that thing? Loud enough. The kind of loud enough that establishes an audience without appearing to try. Two people near the dessert display turned. The man in the well-tailored suit Kevin had been talking to glanced over. A woman nearby with a glass of red wine stopped mid-sip. Brian waited. He wasn't deciding how to respond. He was just giving her what she'd said the space it deserved before answering. Nothing. Because there was nothing he wanted to say to this room about what he'd seen under that tarp. Not to these people. Not in this format. The knowledge he carried in his chest about that curve of metal was his, and he had no reason to hand it to a room that was already organizing itself around laughing at him. The man Kevin had been speaking with said something. About scrap metal. About how George Hargrove must have forgotten about it years ago. Something designed to deepen the joke at Brian's expense. The casual, cruel shorthand of people who feel authorized to be unkind because nobody in the room has given them reason not to be. There was laughter. Comfortable, practiced laughter. The social reflex of a group that had found a direction to point. Brian felt it. He felt every bit of it. He was not made of stone, and the idea that men who chose quiet were made of stone was a fiction invented by people who had never met anyone who chose quiet deliberately rather than by default. He felt the weight of the eyes on him, felt the specific humiliation of being reduced to a punchline in front of people who had formed their entire opinion of him based on the age of his jacket and the residue under his fingernails that soap and water hadn't fully reached, but underneath the feeling, something steadier held. Something he'd been building for 3 years that had nothing to do with anyone in this room. An understanding of what mattered and what didn't that had been forged in hospital corridors and 315 pickups and soft scrambled eggs and bedtime stories. Read aloud until the words were memorized by both of them. The particular exhausted love of a man raising a daughter alone, which has a way of clarifying every question about what is worth fighting over and what simply isn't. This wasn't worth fighting over. Nicole's smile had sharpened into something different. A flicker in her expression that he recognized, even from strangers, even across a room of casual cruelty. She'd wanted a reaction. She'd wanted anything that kept the performance going, and he'd given her nothing, which had not been the plan. And now there was a quality to her attention that was less entertainment and more something else. Something calculating. She set her champagne glass down on a nearby table, a deliberate motion, and walked toward the back of the room, toward the garage entrance. There was a narrow side table near the prop double doors, a functional piece of furniture that the event staff used for miscellaneous items, keys and tags, and the small administrative debris of a large auction in progress. The car under the tarp had never been catalogued, never been assigned a lot number, never been formally included in the estate inventory, which meant its keys had simply been placed in this drawer along with everything else unclaimed, waiting for someone to decide what to do with them. She pulled open the shallow drawer and reached in. She came back with a key ring, old brass, tarnished to the color of a very old coin. 2 keys on it, both worn smooth from handling, the kind of smoothness that came from being picked up and put down thousands of times by a hand that did it without thinking, the way you handled the things you kept without quite knowing why you kept them. She tossed them not to him, not really. She tossed them at the space between where she was standing and where he was standing, and let physics do the work. And the room watched, and Brian caught them, one-handed, against his chest, because his reflexes were better than they had any reason to be. The brass ring was cold. The keys clinked once against each other, and then were still in his palm. My father held on to that thing his entire life, Nicole said. Still loud enough. Still performing. Though there was something fractionally different in her tone now. Slightly elevated, the register of someone who had moved past entertainment into something closer to a point being made. for no reason anyone ever understood, if you want it so badly. Consider it a gift, a beat, perfectly timed, a parting gift. For our guests, the laughter that came was the loudest yet. Not mean in the way that small meanness is mean but bigger, more public. The kind of laughter that a room produced when it had been given permission to release something it had been holding. Directed entirely at the man in the old navy jacket holding the tarnished keys, Brian looked at her, not through her, not past her, at her. 1 second, 2. Long enough to be deliberate, long enough that her smile, fully assembled, did something small and involuntary at the corners that she didn't appear to notice. He said, "Thank you." That was all. No edge on it. No performance of dignity. No pointed calm designed to communicate how very calm he was being. Just 2 words that were exactly what they were, stripped of subtext, because he genuinely didn't have any subtext to offer her. He was grateful for the keys. He didn't have anywhere else to put that feeling. He turned and walked to the garage. Not fast, not slow. The pace of a man going somewhere he'd decided to go, which is its own statement, which communicates something specific about the relationship between a person and their own time. He didn't look back. He didn't hear what followed because he wasn't listening anymore, had already moved on the way you moved on, from a room that had nothing left to offer you. What he did not know, standing in the garage, under the fluorescent lights, with the tarp in front of him and the old keys in his hand, was that Nicole Hargrove stood in the doorway for 11 seconds after he left, according to later accounts from 2 people who had no reason to fabricate the detail. Stood there with the residue of her own performance still in the air around her and an expression on her face that nobody in that room could quite read. Not satisfaction, not discomfort. Something more unsettled than either. She had expected something from him and had gotten something entirely different, and the entirely different thing was sitting in her chest in a way she couldn't easily relocate. But Brian didn't know any of that. He knew the key ring was cold. He knew the tarp was in front of him. He knew that the 2 keys on the ring were both worn smooth, the second one slightly more worn than the first, which meant it had been used more recently, which was interesting for a car that everyone in this house appeared to have forgotten existed. He lifted one edge of the tarp carefully. The smell that came out was immediate and specific. Decades of enclosure, oil and rubber and time. But beneath that, something that was almost metallic sweetness. The smell of a particular grade of lubricant that had been applied with care rather than necessity. And Brian had been working with old machines long enough that the distinction registered in the base of his brain before he'd consciously processed it. He looked at what was underneath for a long moment. Then he lowered the tarp carefully back into place. He walked out of the garage, through the back hallway, out a side door, and sat on a low stone wall in the darkness behind the estate for a while, with the key ring in his hand and the Oregon October cold moving around him like it had somewhere to be. His phone showed 9:47 p.m. He texted Kevin, "Going to need the flatbed tomorrow morning." Kevin texted back 40 seconds later, all capitals, "What did you find?" Brian didn't answer that. He put the phone in his pocket and looked at the lit windows of the house, and thought about a curve he'd seen in the beam of a phone light for approximately 20 seconds, and the way that 20 seconds had rearranged every assumption he'd walked in with tonight. He drove home, paid Mrs. Perkins, who pressed a foil-wrapped plate of cookies on him before he could decline, and told him Gracie had done her reading without being asked, which was its own small miracle. He climbed the stairs and stood in the doorway of Gracie's room, the way he always stood in that doorway, long enough to hear her breathing and make sure it was the deep, even breathing of real sleep, rather than the shallow, almost sleep of a child, waiting for someone to come say goodnight. Deep, even. The gummy bear-scented shampoo she'd picked out herself drifting across the hall. He went to his own room, lay on top of the covers without taking his shoes off, stared at the ceiling for approximately 90 seconds. Then he got up, went to the garage, and opened the 4th shelf of the steel bookcase where he kept his reference materials. Not the modern guides, the old ones. The ones he'd collected from estate sales and antiquarian dealers, and one remarkable afternoon at a university library book sale, that had produced 7 volumes of early 20th century experimental automotive documentation for $3 apiece. He pulled out the volume on American prototype engineering between 1935 and 1965. Turned to the index. Started reading. He was in the garage until 2 in the morning. He did not find what he was looking for in the first volume, or the second. In the third volume, a slim thing with a cracked spine and water damage along the bottom right corners of every page, there was a section on competitive prototype development during a specific period in American automotive history, and within that section, a cluster of pages about a series of experimental vehicles that had been built, and then, depending on the account, lost, destroyed, or never confirmed to have existed beyond the planning stage. One of those vehicles had a profile sketch on page 47, a side view line drawing, the kind of technical illustration made to communicate geometry rather than beauty, functional rather than artistic, but which showed, in the spare language of engineering draftsmanship, a curve. Brian held the book up under the light. He looked at the curve in the drawing. He set the book flat on the work table and held his phone next to the relevant page. He had not taken a photograph in the estate garage earlier because he had not wanted to draw attention to his interest. He had not lifted the tarp far enough to document anything. He had only seen what he had seen for 20 seconds with a phone light. But his memory for geometry was not the kind of memory that required photographs. He sat down on the rolling stool at the work table, the old book open in front of him, page 47, the line drawing with the specific curve. Outside, Portland was doing what Portland did in October. Rain on the garage roof, the particular sound of water moving through the gutters at the back edge of the building, which needed cleaning, which had been needing cleaning since September, and which he kept meaning to address. Brian put his hand flat on the page next to the line drawing. His hand was not entirely steady. He sat in the cold garage in the rain, and he thought about Carl Whitmore, a name he'd just read in a footnote on page 49, a man whose documented work had ended in the late 1980s without explanation. He thought about the tarnished key ring in his jacket pocket. He thought about what a 40-year absence meant in terms of historical record, in terms of collector knowledge, in terms of the kind of value that accreted around things when enough time passed and enough searching failed to produce results. He thought about Gracie asleep upstairs in the rental house with the slow porch light. He thought about Ellen, briefly, the way he always thought about Ellen in the quiet hours. Grief, after a certain point, became less a wave than a current. Always there, moving beneath everything, sometimes surfacing and sometimes not. He had learned not to fight the current. He had learned to simply notice it and keep moving. Then he stopped thinking and started making notes, because the way forward from this kind of moment, the only responsible way forward for a man built the way Brian Cole was built, was not to feel things about what he'd seen. It was to prove what he'd seen. Or disprove it. Either outcome was acceptable. What was not acceptable was arriving at a conclusion through hope rather than evidence, because hope was not a method. Hope was just wearing better clothes. He wrote for 2 hours. Precise technical notes in the small spiral-bound notebook he kept on the second shelf, the one he used for documentation when he was uncertain about something and needed to create a record of his uncertainty. He sketched the curve from memory, annotated it with the proportions he'd estimated in that brief window of visibility, and set the sketch next to the line drawing on page 47. He compared them for a long time. Then he closed the notebook and the reference book both, and turned off the garage light and stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark. The rain had stopped. The porch light at the house came on in its own time. He walked toward it and watched it dense, illuminate the front step and the pot of something his neighbor had given him in the spring that had since grown structural in the planter, the specific dignity of a plant that had simply decided to survive. He went inside. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and he thought, if I'm right about what I saw tonight, then the woman who threw those keys at me gave away something she has no idea she gave away. And that thought should have felt like something uncomplicated, like satisfaction, or the clean pleasure of knowing something important that someone else dismissed. Instead, It felt complicated in a way he didn't examine. Because she hadn't just given away a car. If he was right, she'd given away the last thing her father had kept for 30 years without ever explaining why. The last object in a very large estate that still held a secret, still held something private and unresolved in the life of a man who was otherwise all public record. And whether Nicole Hargrove deserved that loss, or didn't deserve it, or deserved something entirely different, was not really the point. The point was that the keys were in his jacket pocket, and the curve was in his memory. And tomorrow Kevin was coming with the flatbed. He was asleep before he finished the thought. 3:15 the next afternoon. School pickup, parking lot Gracie. Came through the door with a drawing she'd made in art class that she wanted to explain in detail before they'd even reached the truck. Something involving a horse and a mountain and what she described as the sky being complicated. She talked all the way to the truck and all the way home, and Brian listened to every word, the way he always listened, not waiting for her to finish so he could respond, but actually following the logic of the horse and the complicated sky with the attention it deserved. Because that was the work. That was the actual work. Everything else was everything else. But later, after dinner, after homework, after the teeth brushing, and the book and the good night and the breathing check at the door, Brian went back to the garage. The car Kevin had helped him haul that morning now occupied one full bay of his modest space, sitting under the same canvas tarp it had worn for 30 years. Kevin had asked more than once why Brian was bothering with what looked, by any reasonable measure, like a worthless pile of rust. Brian had said he wanted to take a closer look before deciding. Kevin had accepted this with the patience of a man who had learned not to ask Brian Cole follow-up questions until Brian Cole was ready to answer them. Brian put on gloves. He lifted the tarp. The first thing he documented was the chassis number. He found it where it should have been, stamped into the frame rail on the driver's side, partially obscured by surface rust, but legible under the LED work light he positioned close to the metal. He photographed it from 3 angles, wrote it down in the notebook. Then he went to his reference shelf and cross-checked it against 3 separate manufacturer databases he maintained in printed form, because digital databases got updated to reflect current knowledge, and old print catalogs reflected what was known at the time. And sometimes the gap between those 2 things was where the truth lived. The number didn't match. He checked again. Went to the second database. Third database, the number existed, but it belonged to a vehicle that had been produced in a different state by a different manufacturer and was currently, according to the last documented record Brian could find, sitting in a private collection in Arizona. A vehicle that had been publicly verified and accounted for. 2 vehicles. 1 chassis number. Brian sat back on his heels and looked at the stamped metal for a long moment. One of 2 things. Either this car had been given the identification of another vehicle deliberately, with intention, which required access to records and resources that suggested institutional involvement beyond a private owner acting alone. Or the database itself was wrong, which was possible but less interesting. He wrote down both hypotheses. He was not in the business of choosing between hypotheses until the evidence made choosing unavoidable. He moved to the engine bay. He worked for 4 hours that first night. Not restoration. Documentation. He was building a file the way he had built files on difficult engineering problems in his previous life, the way he had approached anything that required proof rather than opinion. The engine told him something different from what the chassis number told him. The chassis number was wrong in a way that suggested concealment. The engine was wrong in a way that suggested genius. The internal geometry of the combustion chamber described a compression ratio that was not, by any reasonable standard, achievable for a vehicle manufactured in the era suggested by its cosmetic age. Whoever had designed this engine had arrived at a solution that, according to Brian's detailed knowledge of automotive engineering history, had not been documented in mainstream application until nearly a decade after this vehicle appeared to have been built, which meant either the dating was wrong or the engineer had been ahead of everyone else by 10 years, quietly, in a machine that nobody had been allowed to know about. He photographed the cylinder head from 7 angles. 7 angles. He measured and remeasured. He wrote down numbers that didn't add up to anything comfortable. Then he went inside, sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on, and the rest of the house dark and quiet, and he began writing a letter to the one person in a field full of skeptics, whose specific area of expertise sat exactly at this intersection of era and technology, and the history of what had been developed and then deliberately buried. He had read Dr. Sandra Callahan's work, 3 papers and 1 long-form historical monograph on the development of pre-war American automotive engineering, and the specific phenomenon of advanced prototype work that never made it to production because the companies that commissioned it went under, or the war intervened, or something else happened to remove the work from the record without destroying it entirely. Her argument, meticulously sourced, was that the official history of American automotive development had significant gaps, and that some of those gaps contained things that had been hidden rather than lost. He wrote to her until midnight. Attached 23 photographs. Included the 4-page technical comparison document he'd drafted from memory and measurement. And then, because he'd already been rejected 4 times by people who hadn't looked closely enough, he added 1 more paragraph that was not technical at all. It simply said, "I am not looking for validation. I am looking for someone who knows enough to tell me I'm wrong if I'm wrong. If you are that person, please call me." He hit send and went to bed, mourning Gracie Seller's alarm. Scrambled eggs, soft, 2 pieces of toast buttered all the way to the edges, 3:15 pickup, the routine that held everything else in its frame. The call came at 7 a.m. the following day. He was in the garage, midway through a second careful examination of the suspension geometry, when his phone rang with an area code he didn't recognize. Sandra Callahan's voice was measured. Academic in register, the particular cadence of someone who had spent decades choosing words, precisely because words in her field had to carry weight without bending under it. She did not begin with pleasantries. She said his name to confirm she had the right number, and then the photograph of the weld seam at the lower left corner of the engine block. "I need 3 additional angles of that specific area." Before I say anything else, his chest didn't move. Not visibly. Why that seam specifically? A pause. Long, deliberate. Because if it shows what I think it shows, Mr. Cole, then we need to have a conversation that should not happen over email. Can you tell me what you think it shows? Another pause, different quality. The pause of someone who had been wrong before about something that mattered and was not willing to be wrong in that direction again. "No, not over the phone. I need to see it in person." She flew in 4 days later with 2 colleagues. Dr. Gary Fenn, who had the quiet demeanor of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove anything and had arrived at the authority that comes after that, and a junior colleague who carried equipment cases with the focused efficiency of someone whose job was to ensure the instruments arrived ready before anyone started talking. They were in his garage for 6 hours. Brian made coffee at the 2-hour mark and set cups within reach without interrupting anyone. He answered questions when asked, directed attention when directed, and otherwise stayed near enough to observe and far enough to leave them room. It was Dr. Gary Fenn who stopped first. Not dramatically. He simply set down the calibration tool he'd been using on the engine block, straightened up, and looked at the car for a long moment without any particular instrumental focus. Just looking. The way you looked at something when you'd stopped measuring and started understanding. Then he looked at Brian. "I have been in this field for 34 years, he said it without performance, as a fact establishing context. "I have turned down 11 requests to verify claims like the one you've made. In every one of those cases, the evidence didn't hold." He paused. Looked at the car again. "This evidence holds," Brian nodded. Looked at his watch. "I need to pick up my daughter at 3:15. Gary Fenn looked at him for a second with something in his expression that took Brian a moment to identify. Respect was part of it, but also something warmer. Something that recognized the specific gravity of a man who held his responsibilities in the order he held them, regardless of what else was happening in his life. "We'll be here," Fenn said. Brian went to pick up Gracie. She had made a new friend that week, a girl named Paige who had moved from somewhere else and liked the same cartoons. And she talked about Paige for most of the drive home, with the focused intensity of someone reporting on a significant development. Brian listened, asked appropriate questions, tracked everything she was telling him, because it mattered to her, and therefore it mattered. He dropped her at Mrs. Perkins' house, explained the situation without explaining the situation, and drove back. Sandra Callahan and Dr. Fenn were standing outside the garage door when he returned, both on their phones, both carrying the contained energy of people managing something significant. Inside, their colleague was finishing documentation. The three of them sat in the garage on whatever surfaces were available, and Sandra told him what they'd found, what the instruments and the archive records, and the measured comparison against the historical blueprints she'd brought, had confirmed. The vehicle was real. The prototype that had been documented in fragments in 3 separate academic papers, and 1 government record with most of its relevant details redacted, the one that had been built and then vanished from the record before it could be officially tested or publicly acknowledged, the one that represented 11 years of engineering effort by a man named Carl Whitmore, who had disappeared from documented history sometime in the late 1980s. It was in Brian Cole's garage. It had been in his garage for 11 days. Before that, it had been under a canvas tarp in a corner of George Hargrove's estate. Unlisted, uncatalogued, deliberately made to look like nothing worth cataloging. For 30 years, Brian sat with this information for a while, not long. He was not someone who needed a long time to absorb information once the information arrived with evidence attached. He processed it, filed it in the correct part of his understanding, and moved to the next question. The next question was why. Not why it was valuable. He understood the value. He had understood the rough shape of the value from the moment he'd read Carl Whitmore's name in the footnote on page 49 of that 3rd reference volume, at 2 a.m, with his hand not entirely steady on the page. Why had George Hargrove kept it for 30 years without selling it, without displaying it, without explaining it to anyone? That was the question that stayed with him after the experts left, after the preliminary agreements about verification timeline and discretion, after Sandra Callahan shook his hand in the garage doorway and said she'd been working toward this confirmation, in one form or another, for 9 years. Brian locked the garage, walked to the house, made dinner, something with chicken and the carrots that Gracie would eat if they were roasted, but not if they were steamed. A distinction she'd communicated at the age of 6, with the conviction of someone revealing an objective truth about the universe. He served dinner. Gracie talked about Paige again. A small disagreement they'd already resolved in the course of one afternoon, which Brian privately thought was an impressive conflict resolution timeline even by adult standards. He listened. He ate. He thought, in the background of all of it, about a man he'd never met who had kept a secret for 3 decades, and about the daughter who had inherited that secret without knowing it existed and tossed the evidence of it across a room to a stranger for a laugh, and about the keys, still in his jacket pocket, still cold. The weeks after Sandra Callahan's visit had a particular texture, quiet on the surface, everything underneath moving fast. Brian kept working. That was the only response he knew how to have to something that large. Not celebrate, not panic, work. He came back to the garage each night, after Gracie was asleep, and continued the documentation he'd started, moving through the car systematically the way he moved through every restoration, from front to back, from exterior to interior, from obvious to obscure, photographing, measuring, recording, building the file that would eventually become the evidentiary foundation for everything that followed, though he didn't think of it in those terms at the time. At the time, he just thought of it as doing the job correctly. Doing the job correctly was the only thing that ever actually protected you from the consequences of being wrong. 3 weeks into November, Gracie turned 9. She had been anticipating this specific birthday since August, when she had calculated, with the methodical focus she brought to things that mattered to her, exactly how many days remained. Brian had made the cake himself, which was a decision born of love rather than skill, and the result was structurally sound but listed slightly to the left, which Gracie declared made it more interesting than a regular cake. They ate it at the kitchen table, with Mrs. Perkins and her husband from down the street, and Kevin, who had shown up with a wrapped gift that turned out to be a set of children's books about the history of American automobiles, which he presented with the gruffness of a man who had thought about this more carefully than he wanted anyone to know. Gracie had looked at the books for a long moment. Then, at Kevin. "Are these because of the car in the garage?" Kevin had looked at Brian. Brian had looked at the leftward cake. "They're because you're smart," Kevin said finally. "And smart people should know the history of things." Gracie had accepted this with the gravity it deserved, and placed the books on her nightstand that evening, in a position of honor next to the gummy bear shampoo. The night of her birthday, after she was asleep, Brian stood in the doorway of the garage and looked at the car under its working lights, and thought about a 9-year-old who wanted to know the history of things, and about a dead man's notebook he hadn't yet found, and about the particular responsibility of paying attention when something was trying to tell you something. He went back to work. He was 3 weeks and 2 days into the documentation when he found the compartment. He'd been working on the driver's seat, removing it to examine the floor pan underneath for the kind of structural rust that didn't always announce itself from the outside. The seat came out in 2 stages, the way they always came out in vehicles of this era. Unbolting the rails first, and then lifting the whole assembly clear, and setting it to the side on the rubber mat he used to keep components off the concrete. He had the seat rails off and the main bolts loose, and was just beginning to rotate the assembly to clear the transmission tunnel, when his hand pressed against the seat base from underneath and felt something wrong. Not wrong like broken, wrong like intentional. He set the seat down on the mat, crouched beside it, ran both hands slowly along the underside of the seat base, which should have been uniform, padding, spring structure, fabric backing, and found the seam. It was invisible. That was the only accurate word for it. Not hard to see, not subtle, invisible. The stitching continued across it without variation. The same thread, the same tension, the same interval between each stitch. Whoever had done this had matched the existing seatwork with enough precision that you couldn't find the seam by sight. You could only find it by touch, and only if you were pressing flat-palmed against the material with the specific attention that came from looking for structural anomalies in a 40-year-old piece of furniture. Brian sat back on his heels, looked at the seam, thought about it for about 30 seconds, then went inside and got the thinnest blade from the box cutter, set in the kitchen junk drawer, and came back out. He worked slowly. He was always slow when he didn't know what was underneath. The blade separated the stitching in a line of about 4 inches before he had enough clearance to understand what he was looking at. A secondary panel of fabric. Beneath that, a shallow cavity built into the seat base itself, maybe 2 inches deep, lined with oilcloth that had been folded the corners with the kind of care that suggested the person doing the folding had expected whatever was inside to be there for a long time. Inside the oilcloth, packed flat and protected by the cloth on all sides, a notebook with dark brown leather covers. A stack of photographs held together with a rubber band that disintegrated when he touched it. 3 letters, each folded into thirds, each in an envelope that had been sealed, and then the seal reinforced with a small strip of the same oilcloth. Brian did not open any of it immediately. He sat on the cold concrete floor, with the assembly in his lap, and the components spread on the rubber mat beside him, and looked at the ceiling of the garage for a while. The fluorescent light buzzed at a frequency he'd stopped hearing months ago. The rain that had been coming and going all week was going, which meant the garage was very quiet. He was holding something private. That was the feeling, not the feeling of discovery, which he'd already had 3 weeks ago, and had since refined into something more workmanlike. This was different. The notebook, the photographs, the sealed letters. These were not engineering evidence. These were not the kind of document you photographed and sent to experts for verification. These were the kind of thing that belonged to someone. The kind of thing a person kept hidden because they weren't ready to share it. or because the right audience hadn't arrived yet, or because the act of hiding was itself part of the message. He opened the notebook. The handwriting on the first page was younger than what he'd seen on the Hargrove Foundation documents in his research. Steadier, more compressed. The script of someone who wrote a lot and wrote efficiently. A date at the top of the first entry, 1987. And below it, a single sentence that functioned less as a journal opening and more as a declaration to no one in particular. I am keeping this because some things should not be forgotten even when forgetting would be easier. Brian read for an hour. He read about a 24-year-old named George Hargrove, who worked in a repair shop in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the mid-1980s, a period the notebook described not with nostalgia, but with the flat accuracy of someone who had lived through something difficult and saw no reason to dress it up afterward. 2 jobs at one point, the notebook mentioned without making a production of it. Some weeks the second job barely covered what the first job didn't. The kind of financial math that occupied the back of your mind constantly at that age when you were doing it, like background music you couldn't turn off, until eventually you stopped thinking of it as stress and just thought of it as the conditions you were working inside. Carl Whitmore had come into the shop in the spring of that year. The notebook described him as older, though the age George gave put Whitmore in his mid-40s, which wasn't old but felt old to a 24-year-old who had never met anyone that particular combination of unhurried and precise. He drove a car that George didn't recognize at the time and wouldn't know how to classify until much later. He had a repair job that turned out to be more involved than he'd described on the phone. And when the bill came due, Carl Whitmore sat across from George Hargrove in the small office of the repair shop and told him, very directly, that he didn't have the money. He had the car. Not the car he'd brought in for repair. The other one. The one he'd driven behind a truck on a trailer, which George had noticed when Whitmore pulled in and assumed was a separate matter until this moment, when it turned out to be the payment. George's first entry about the car was 2 pages long and contained almost no emotional language, almost entirely descriptive. The dimensions, the mechanical specifications as far as he could determine from an initial examination. The places where what he was looking at didn't match what he expected to be looking at, stated with the precision of someone who knew engines well enough to know when an engine was telling him something unusual about the person who built it. At the very bottom of the second page, one line set apart from the rest. I don't know what this is, but I know it matters. I don't know how yet. Carl Whitmore left a phone number and an address in Missouri and disappeared into the Tulsa afternoon. The phone number was disconnected within 6 months. A letter George sent to the Missouri address came back undeliverable within the year. He made one attempt to find Whitmore through directory services in 1989 and found nothing, which in 1989 was more definitive than it would have been later because the world was smaller, in the ways it recorded people who chose not to be found. Brian turned pages. The entries were not consistent in frequency. Sometimes weeks between them, sometimes months. But they were consistent in a different way, in the quality of attention George brought to whatever he was recording, which was the attention of a man who understood that the thing he was writing about was going to matter more than he could currently articulate, and who was determined to be honest about that uncertainty rather than paper over it, with confidence he didn't yet have. By the time Brian reached the entries from the mid-1990s, George Hargrove had begun building his business. The notebook recorded this in the margins of entries that were primarily about the car. An offhand mention of a deal that had come through, a new office, a second employee. The business grew in the margins of entries about a car that didn't move from its storage unit in Tulsa, except for the annual maintenance visits George documented with the care of someone keeping medical records on a patient he intended to see well. He turned down his first offer for the car in 1994. The notebook recorded the amount, which was substantial for a man at George's stage of business development, and then recorded his reasoning in 2 sentences. I looked at the number and felt nothing. The only thing I felt was certain I wasn't selling it, which is a different kind of knowing than knowing why. The offers came again, 4 times between 1994 and 2009, each one larger than the last. Each declined with the same quality of certainty that seemed to exist independent of the amount being offered. By the last offer, in 2009 at $4.2 million, Brian had to stop and do math in his head to register what turning it down had meant in terms of George Hargrove's available choices, and the conclusion he reached was that refusing had been an act of something beyond preference. Call it conviction, or the specific resolve of a man who had decided some things were not for sale, not because the price was wrong, but because sale itself was the wrong kind of transaction for what this object actually was. Brian was at page 73 when he heard something. Not inside the house. Not Gracie. He'd learned to keep one ear tuned to the sounds of the house the way you learned any system you were responsible for, and what he heard now was not from that direction. A car slowing on the street outside. He waited. The engine didn't cut. After a moment, the car moved on. He exhaled. Went back to the notebook. He read until 1 in the morning, following what was significant, returning to passages that contained information he needed to sit with longer than a first pass allowed. What he found in those 112 pages was not what he'd expected. He'd expected the notebook of a collector. He'd found the book of a man who had never stopped being the 24-year-old in the Tulsa repair shop, who had carried that origin point through every year of accumulating success like a stone in a pocket. Always there, always the same weight, always the reminder of what things had looked like before success had made, looking at them easier. He put the notebook down at 1:15 and picked up the photographs. Some were of the car, in various storage configurations across the years, each one slightly less neglected looking than the last, as George's resources for maintaining it grew. Some were of a man Brian assumed was Carl Whitmore from the context. 2 photographs, both taken at a distance and apparently from the repair shop period, one showing him near a truck bed and one showing him in the shop office across from a younger man who had George Hargrove's eyes even at 24. One photograph was of a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of what appeared to be a school event backdrop, wearing a dress that suggested the photograph was meant to be formal. But this was a candid, not the official version. The girl was laughing at something outside the frame, caught mid-motion, hair escaping whatever arrangement it had been in, on the back of the photograph, in the same handwriting as the notebook. 4 words. She doesn't know yet. Brian turned the photograph over, looked at the girl's face for a long time. Nicole Hargrove. Almost certainly, the age worked. The timing of the photograph, based on the image quality and the backdrop style, was consistent with the mid-2000s. She doesn't know yet. He set the photograph down carefully. He did not open the letters. He looked at them for a long time, the 3 sealed envelopes with their oilcloth reinforcements, and he made a decision about them that was straightforward enough once he'd thought it through. The letters were not for him. They were not for any expert or any verifier or for the purpose of establishing historical provenance or market value, or any of the other things that were going to need establishing in the weeks ahead. They were for her. He put them back in the oilcloth. Put the photographs on top. Put the notebook on top of the photographs. Folded the cloth closed. Set the whole bundle on the second shelf of the steel bookcase, between a vintage shop manual and a reference guide to American brake systems, where it would be safe and where it would wait. Then he sat on the rolling stool with his phone in his hand and thought about how you offered something like this to someone who had thrown the keys at you for a laugh. He didn't figure it out that night. He went to beds instead, and in the morning there was breakfast and school and the normal wait of Tuesday. And the problem sat in the back of his mind in the way of problems that didn't have obvious solutions. Not demanding, just present, like something waiting patiently for the right conditions. 7 days later, an article ran in Automotive Heritage Quarterly. Brian hadn't given anyone permission to publish, hadn't been contacted by the publication. What had happened, as best he could reconstruct it later, was that one of the authentication team had mentioned the discovery in the context of a professional conversation. With a colleague, the colleague had mentioned it to someone else. and the chain of second-hand mentions had produced a paragraph in a trade publication that contained no names, no specific location, and enough technical specificity to be unmistakable to anyone who had been paying attention to the right conversations for the right number of years. He read it on his phone on a Thursday morning, standing in the garage with his coffee, and his first thought was not about his own exposure. His first thought was, she's going to read this, because of course she was. Nicole Hargrove had the resources and the staff to ensure that anything touching the Hargrove estate crossed her desk, and an article about a potentially historic automotive discovery connected to a Pacific Northwest restoration shop was exactly the kind of thing that would arrive in her inbox within hours of publication. He was right. She called on a Saturday. He didn't pick up. He was at Gracie's soccer practice, standing on the sideline in the November cold with the other parents, watching 9-year-olds demonstrate various creative interpretations of the offside rule. And when his phone buzzed, he glanced at an area code he didn't recognize and let it go to voicemail, because he was at soccer practice, and that was where he was. The voicemail was 47 seconds long. He listened to it in the parking lot afterward, while Gracie climbed into the truck and found her water bottle with the focused determination of someone who had very specific feelings about post-practice hydration. Nicole's voice on the voicemail was controlled in a different direction from the voice in the auction room. Tighter rather than easy. The control of someone managing a feeling rather than the control of someone who wasn't having one. Mr. Cole. This is Nicole Hargrove. I believe you have something that was my father's. I'd like to talk about that. I'd also like a pause, brief, which probably cost her something to allow. I'd like to understand what you found. Please call me back. Gracie from the passenger seat, with the directness of 9-year-olds who had not yet learned to pretend they hadn't heard things. Who's Nicole Hargrove? Brian considered this. Someone I met at an event a few weeks ago. What kind of event? A fancy one. You would have hated it. Gracie appeared to find this satisfying. She located her water bottle. The subject closed. He called Nicole back that evening, after dinner, after homework, after the bedtime routine was complete, and the house was quiet. He sat at the kitchen table, with his notebook open, and called the number from the voicemail. She picked up on the second ring. Mr. Cole, Miss Hargrove. The silence that followed was maybe 2 seconds, but a 2 seconds with specific texture. The kind that happened when two people were each waiting to see whether the other one was going to say the obvious thing or skip past it. She skipped past it, not toward warmth, toward efficiency, which was its own kind of interesting. I'd like to come and see the car when, next week. I can be in Portland by Tuesday. He considered the calendar. Gracie had a dentist appointment. Tuesday afternoon, unmovable in the way dentist appointments were unmovable when you'd already rescheduled them once. Thursday, a pause. Fine. Thursday, nothing about the auction room. Nothing about the keys or the laugh or the 11 seconds she'd stood in the doorway after he left, which she didn't know he'd been told about. He hadn't decided yet whether to bring any of it up. He suspected he wouldn't. He suspected it would either surface naturally, when the time was right, or it wouldn't need to surface at all, because what was coming would be larger than what had already happened. He was right about that too. Nicole Hargrove arrived at his garage on a Thursday afternoon in November, which in Portland meant cold and specific, a temperature that went through coats rather than stopping at them. She drove herself. A rental, practical, jeans, a good sweater in a shade of gray that was clearly expensive. In the way that clothes purchased, without checking prices, were expensive, the kind of thing that looked simple and wasn't. No assistant, no attorney, no buffer of any kind between her and whatever was about to happen. He opened the garage door when her car pulled up. She walked in and looked at the car. Not at him, at the car. He'd removed the tarp for the first time since it arrived, had it sitting without the canvas for only the second time in however many years it had been covered, under the full brightness of his working lights. Not a flattering presentation in the way that presentation was sometimes flattering, an accurate one, showing everything, hiding nothing. The way he preferred to present evidence. She stood and looked at it for a long time. He let her. When she finally turned, Her expression was the one he'd been trying to anticipate and hadn't quite managed to. Not calculating, not performing anything. Something he hadn't seen in that brief encounter 3 weeks ago. Something more like standing on unfamiliar ground and not yet knowing which direction to trust. I need to buy it back flat. Direct. The opening she'd decided on in advance. The clean declarative sentence of someone used to negotiation starting from position rather than conversation. I know. Name a price. Brian wiped his hands on the shopcloth he kept tucked in his belt loop, a habitual gesture that had nothing to do with whether his hands were dirty. I'm not selling it. The fraction of a faux pas was very small. She'd prepared for this possibility. I can offer more than whatever you're anticipating. I'm sure you can. Then why? Because I don't want to sell it. He set the cloth down on the workbench and looked at her directly. I want to know why your father kept it. Nicole Hargrove looked at him. Really looked the way she'd started to in the auction room doorway, and then apparently thought better of and stopped. The difference now was that she didn't stop. She kept looking. And something in the quality of her attention shifted, from the register of someone assessing a negotiating position to the register of someone encountering a question they hadn't prepared for. I don't know why he kept it. I know you don't. Brian turned to the second shelf of the steel bookcase. But I think I might. He brought the oilcloth bundle to the workbench and set it between them. She looked at it without touching it. What is that? I found it inside the seat base, built into it. Whoever made the compartment matched the upholstery stitch for stitch. He paused. There's a notebook. Photographs. 3 sealed letters, a silence with different weight than the earlier ones. Sealed. Her voice was flat in a way that was working to stay flat. I didn't open the letters. The notebook I read, he waited for whatever was underneath her surface to decide what it was. I read enough to know it's not about the car. Not really. Nicole looked at the oilcloth bundle. Her hand moved toward it and then stopped, hovering for a moment, and then she pressed her palm flat on the workbench surface next to it rather than on it. An almost touch, a held breath made visible. That's my father's handwriting on the envelope. Not a question, not even quite a statement. Something said aloud because saying it aloud was the only way to make it real. Yes, he kept it here, in the car, for 30 years, based on the notebook. Yes, she pulled her hand back and crossed her arms and looked at the car instead of at the bundle, which Brian recognized as a person needing a moment that didn't involve direct eye contact with the thing that was currently too large to look at directly. He gave her the moment. Outside, a car passed on the street, bass from its sound system audible briefly and then gone. The fluorescent light in the back corner of the garage made its small, intermittent sound, the one he'd been meaning to investigate for a month. Nicole uncrossed her arms. What does it say? The notebook? Yes. Brian considered how to answer this in a way that was honest, without being a summary that replaced the reading, which was not what the notebook was for. It says your father started with very little, that this car came to him when he had almost nothing, and he never forgot that. That he thought about you more than you knew. He paused. And that he was afraid he'd failed at something that couldn't be fixed once you noticed it was broken. The silence after this was of a third kind entirely. The kind that came when something true arrived in a room that wasn't prepared for it. She didn't look at him. She looked at the car. And then, very quietly, with the care of someone picking up something they were afraid might break. Can I read it? I was hoping you'd ask. He brought the 2 mismatched chairs from the back of the garage and set them near the workbench. He brought her the notebook. He went back to his own work on the opposite side because she didn't need an audience and he didn't want to be one. She read. He worked, or approximated working. He was mostly listening to the quality of the silence from her side of the garage, which changed as she moved through the pages, which had texture and weather. The way silence could, when someone was moving through something that mattered. He heard one sharp intake of breath at a page he could have predicted, which he noted but didn't look up at. He was watching the clock without watching it. 3:15 was coming the way it always came. At 2:53 he set down his tools. I need to pick up my daughter. Nicole looked up from the notebook. She had not been crying, or rather she had been and had stopped, and what remained was the precise arrangement of a person who had been through something and was managing the aftermath with the composure of someone who had a lot of practice. Managing difficult afternoons. Gracie. Yes, the 9-year-old, as of 2 weeks ago. She's very clear about the distinction. Something moved across Nicole's face that was not a smile but was in the vicinity of one. I'll wait here if that's all right. It was such a different sentence from any she'd offered him before. Not a demand or a position, just a request. The kind you made when you needed something simple and didn't have a strategy around it. The coffee machine's on the shelf to the left if you want it, he said. It's not good. But it works. He went to pick up Gracie. She came through the school doors with the specific energy of a Friday afternoon, backpack over one shoulder, already talking before she reached the truck about something that had happened in PE, she characterized as both unfair and funny. Her preferred register for the best stories. Brian drove and listened and asked the right questions, and was entirely there, entirely present, which was the only way he knew how to be. He dropped Gracie at Mrs. Perkins' house. Didn't explain. Mrs. Perkins was good at not asking questions that required explanations. When he got back, Nicole was on page 94 of the notebook, and there was a mug of coffee on the workbench near her that she'd apparently made for herself while he was gone. She had reached the later entries, the ones where the handwriting changed. He sat back down on his side and did not work this time. He waited. She read the last pages slowly, much slower than the earlier ones. The pace of someone who understood. They were reading something for the first time and the last time, simultaneously, that the opportunity to encounter it for the first time was ending with each line and could not be recovered. He knew what the last entries said. He'd read them on the cold garage floor, with his hand not entirely steady, and the rain on the roof and the knowledge building in his chest of what this document was going to mean to the people it was meant for. The greatest thing I can leave behind is not the company, not the buildings with our name, not the accounts. It is simply the chance for you to become someone genuinely good, someone who measures herself by what she does, with people who cannot do anything for her in return. Someone who remembers that the man fixing your car and the woman serving your dinner have stories as real and as serious as your own. Nicole stopped. She didn't turn the page. She just stopped, and the stopping had finality to it. And Brian waited on his side of the garage while she sat on her side and held the notebook and didn't say anything for a while. It was almost 4 in the afternoon. The November light was already beginning to think about leaving, pulling back from the garage windows in the slow way of tides rather than the fast way of sunsets. Nicole set the notebook down on the workbench. Didn't close it, just set it down with her hand resting on the page she'd just read. He never said any of this. Her voice had a different texture than it had had all afternoon, stripped of something. The architecture of how she usually spoke, the controlled register of a woman who had decided at some point that the way she spoke was itself a form of armor, was still there but thinner. Not once. Not directly. Brian considered what to offer. He was not, by nature or choice, someone who filled silences with noise. But this silence asked for something. My wife died 3 years ago. He said it without preamble, because preamble would have been the wrong kind of sound. She had 3 weeks where she knew. I kept thinking I'd say the things I needed to say when the time was right. When I had the right words. When it felt like the right moment, he paused. The right moment kept being the next one. Nicole looked at him. I didn't say all of it. He held her gaze. I said enough. But not all of it. And the rest of it, he glanced at the notebook. The rest of it is still just living in me somewhere, taking up space, looking for somewhere to go. The garage was quiet in the specific way it got when both people in it were sitting with something true. I have to go, Nicole said finally. But she didn't move. I have calls this evening. A board meeting tomorrow morning in Chicago. Okay, can I? She stopped. Started again. Can I come back? To read the letters, they're yours? He said it simply because it was simply true. You can take them tonight if you want. No, quick, certain. I want to read them here. He didn't ask why. The letters in her Chicago apartment, or her glass and steel office, would be a different thing than the letters in this garage, in this light, near this car, near the person who had found them, and decided without much deliberation that they belonged to her rather than to anyone else. "Sunday," he said. "Gracie has soccer in the morning. We're usually back by noon, Sunday afternoon." She picked up the notebook and held it for a moment. "Can I take this tonight? I want to read it again." He had not anticipated this, but recognized it immediately as the right thing. "Yes, bring it back Sunday." She tucked it under her arm, picked up the oilcloth bundle with the letters and photographs inside, and held it against her chest. At the garage door, she stopped and turned back. "Why did you give these to me?" Not accusing, genuinely asking. "You could have used them for leverage, or..." "They're yours." The same thing he would keep saying, because it kept being simply true. "There's no version of this where they're not yours." She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone encountering a straightforward thing they'd forgotten existed. Then she left. Brian stood in the open garage door and watched her car pull onto the street and disappear. The November cold came in with the patience of something that knew it was going to win eventually. He let it come for a minute, then he closed the door. He looked at the car. He looked at the empty spot on the shelf where the notebook had been, and the shelf beside it where the oilcloth had sat. He thought about a woman sitting in a hotel room in Portland tonight, reading the handwriting of a man who'd sat in the back of her third-grade play and left before the lights came up, and what it was like to receive something 30 years late that should have been handed over in person and wasn't, and how you decided what to do with the understanding you got instead of the one you deserved. He picked up his tools. Went back to work. The article in Automotive Heritage Quarterly was still circulating. Sandra Callahan had called twice during the week to update him on the verification process and to manage the information bleeding out around the edges of the agreement, to keep things quiet until the formal process was complete. The number of people who knew what he had in his garage was still small, but small was no longer the same as contained, and contained was no longer the same as controlled. Something was coming. He could feel it the way you felt weather that hadn't arrived yet. Sunday came through Saturday first. Gracie's soccer, the cold sideline, the genuinely chaotic small-body athleticism of third-grade girls in competition. And then through a quiet Saturday evening of homework and a movie she'd already seen twice and wanted to see again, which Brian sat through with her, because she laughed in the same 3 places she always laughed, and he had not yet found that anything other than good. Nicole arrived at 12:45 on Sunday. Same rental car, different gray sweater from the Thursday one, which told him she'd thought about what she wore, or at least thought about it enough to change. She carried coffee, 2 cups, held one out when he opened the garage door, with the directness of someone who had decided to stop calculating everything. Before doing it, he took the cup. She walked past him to the workbench and set down the notebook, which she'd clearly read again. The leather cover slightly more handled than when she'd taken it. "I read it twice more," she said, "in the hotel room. And I understood about half of it the first time." She turned. "The second time I understood more. And there were things." She stopped. The stopping of someone dealing with a weight they'd just set down and were now deciding whether to pick back up. "He came to my third-grade play. I didn't know he was there until after. My mom told me weeks later. He sat in the back and left before the lights came up because he had a call at 8 p.m. Brian waited. I thought he didn't come." She looked at the shelf where the oilcloth bundle now sat. "I've thought that for 26 years. The fluorescent light in the back corner made it sound. The one he'd been meaning to fix. He wrote about it," Brian said. "The play? I know. Flat. Then, quieter, I know." She reached out and picked up the bundle, held it in both hands with the care of someone handling something that had been waiting specifically for them. She brought it to the workbench and sat down and began, slowly and deliberately, to open the oilcloth. Brian sat on the other chair, not across from her. Angled, present but not facing directly, the way you sat with someone who needed company without an audience. She opened the first envelope. The paper inside was thin, folded exactly 3 times. The folds sharp, in the way of something that had been folded and refolded more than once before reaching its final form. The handwriting was different from the notebook, more deliberate, The writing of someone who had drafted this before copying it clean, she read, in silence. Her face didn't move much, but her hands tightened slightly on the paper at some point near the middle, and that tightening held for the rest of the page. Brian looked at the car while she read. At the curve that had started everything, visible from where he sat, the specific radius that had stopped him in a garage full of things that didn't stop him. It was strange, looking at it from this angle, this far into everything that had followed. The curve was exactly what it had been on the night of the auction. Unchanged. Indifferent to everything that had happened because of it, things didn't change. People changed around them. Nicole set the first letter down, picked up the second. Outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. A truck passed on the cross street, engine loud and then not. She read the second letter faster than the first. Set it down. Sat for a moment without picking up the third. The air in the garage was very still. She picked up the third letter. This one she read slowly. Slower than the notebook, slower than the first two letters, slower than anything Brian had watched her do in the time they'd spent in this garage. She read it the way you read something when you understood that the opportunity to encounter it for the first time was ending with each word and could not be recovered. She reached the end. Set it down on the workbench among the other two, the oilcloth open around them, and then Nicole Hargrove, who had stood at her father's funeral without a visible tear, who had navigated the entire afternoon of the Hargrove estate auction, with the unflappable surface of someone for whom surfaces were a professional achievement, who had thrown a set of old keys at a stranger for a room's entertainment and smiled at the laugh that followed. Put her face in her hands, not dramatically, not with the shaking shoulders of theatrical grief. Just quietly and privately, the way a person cried when they'd been not crying for a very long time, and had finally found a room small enough and honest enough to let it happen. Brian did not move to her side. He did not offer anything. He sat in his chair at an angle and looked at the car and gave her the complete privacy of his non-witness, which was a specific and underrated form of care. The choice not to make someone's moment into a shared experience before they'd decided to share it. After a while, the quality of the silence in the garage changed from active to settling. Nicole lifted her face from her hands. Did not look embarrassed. That was something, Brian thought, that she had arrived at the point where she was done performing for rooms, at least this room, at least today. She looked at the letters on the workbench. She looked at the car. He said the car was the only thing he'd owned before he became someone. Before everything got complicated by what he was supposed to be, her voice was holding but just. He said he was afraid I would only ever know the version of him that wore the title. And he didn't know how to show me the other one while he was alive. So he left it here. For someone to find, the fluorescent light buzzed. Someone did. Brian said. The silence after that was not empty. It had specific weight. The weight of something that had just been resolved without anyone deciding to resolve it. The weight of two people. Sitting in a cold garage, in November in Portland with something between them that neither of them had been looking for, and both of them had needed. Nicole gathered the letters with the care she'd unpacked them with, refolded them with the same precision, tucked them back. She left the notebook on the shelf. She picked up the oilcloth bundle and held it against her chest. I'll call you about the auction, she said. About what makes sense. She was at the garage door when she stopped and turned back. Why did you give these to me? She'd asked this before. She was asking it again with different weight. You could have used them. The story alone, the notebook, the letters, a dead billionaire's secret. That's worth something to the right publication. You could have leveraged it. You chose not to. They're yours, Brian said. There's no version of this where they're not yours. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she left. Brian closed the garage door, looked at the car in the working lights, looked at the notebook on the shelf. He was washing dishes after dinner when his phone buzzed with a text from Sandra Callahan. We need to talk about timeline. Things are moving faster than I expected. Someone at the magazine talked. He dried his hands. Texted back. Call me in 20 minutes. He put Gracie to bed first. The book. The good night. The breathing check at the door. Everything in order. Then he sat at the kitchen table and waited for the phone to ring, and when it rang, Sandra's voice was measured in the way it always was, but carrying more urgency than before. A reporter from a major publication had called her office, planning to describe the discovery in terms that were, in her word, sensational. And Brian said, "What do we need to do?" And she told him, and they talked for 40 minutes, and when he hung up, the house was entirely quiet. He turned off the kitchen light, went to bed. He thought about the entry dated 1994, when George Hargrove had looked at a large number and felt nothing except certainty that he wasn't selling. The way conviction that clear didn't require reasoning, it just required honoring. He thought about Carl Whitmore, who had handed 11 years of work to a stranger for a repair bill he couldn't pay, and then disappeared into Missouri and never confirmed whether he knew what he'd left behind. Sometimes the person who made the thing never got to see what the thing became. Brian had been living with that understanding for 3 years in a different register. It didn't get easier, but it did get familiar, and familiar was its own kind of manageable. He drove through the dark toward home. 3:15 would come, the way it always came. He'd be there. The call from Ronald Crane came on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after Nicole left the garage, with the letters pressed against her chest and an expression on her face that Brian had filed away and not examined too closely. Crane wasn't calling Brian. Crane was calling Nicole. Brian only knew about it because Nicole told him, 3 days after the fact, in a phone call that was shorter than the ones they'd been having and carried a different quality. Tighter, like something that had been tested and held. She told it simply. Crane had requested a private meeting. She'd agreed because she'd known him for 15 years and he'd managed significant portions of the Hargrove legal portfolio. And she'd had no reason yet to walk in already on guard. He'd laid it out carefully. The transfer of the vehicle had been oral, performed at a social event, not documented by any instrument that would satisfy chain of title requirements for a vehicle of this category. No bill of sale, no signed release. No witness who had recorded the exchange in any format that held legal weight. An attorney of reasonable skill, Crane had explained, would find this a straightforward matter to argue. Nicole had listened to all of it. She knew how to listen to things she didn't want to hear. She'd been trained in that particular skill by decades of boardrooms, where the information arriving was frequently inconvenient, and the appropriate response was to absorb it, before deciding what to do with it. Then she'd asked him a question. She told Brian the question and he was quiet for a moment. Then, what did he say? He said that wasn't relevant to the legal question. And what did you say? I said it was the only relevant question and that the meeting was over. Brian was quiet again, not processing, sitting with what the processing had already produced. You didn't have to tell me this, he said. I know. A pause that was brief and direct. I'm telling you because you should know that I know what the right thing is. Even when someone explains very carefully why the wrong thing would be easier. He didn't say anything sentimental about that. She wouldn't have wanted him to, he said. Okay. Thank you. Don't thank me. Her voice was dry in the way of people who had learned to use dryness as structural support. I'm still figuring out how to be someone who does the right thing, instead of just knowing what it is. That was honest. He respected it because he'd had the same problem in his own life in different forms, and he knew how much it cost to say it without performing the saying. He said, "That's actually harder. Most people only get to the knowing." The line was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had to go. They hung up. 3 days after that, Sandra Callahan called to tell him that Barrett Whitmore Classic Auctions in Denver had reached out about hosting the sale, not because it was the closest venue, because it was the right one. Their specialty sales had produced 3 world records in the past decade, and the people at the table for a sale of this significance needed to be the people who understood what they were sitting at, who would bid with the accuracy of genuine knowledge, rather than the checkbook enthusiasm of collectors who happened to be wealthy. Brian told her he needed to talk to Nicole first. Sandra was quiet for exactly the right amount of time. Of course, he called Nicole. She agreed to Denver without discussion. And then she said something that had not been part of the conversation until that moment. offered in the direct, unhesitating way she'd been moving towards since the Sunday, with the letters. I'd like the proceeds to go to the right places, at least part of them. The Hargrove Foundation has programs. I'm rebuilding some of them. But what you do with your share, she paused. I think you already know what you're doing with it, he did. He'd known for a while, in the way you knew things that hadn't announced themselves, but had simply been sitting there, waiting for the conditions to become right. The academy was going to happen anyway, he said. This just makes it happen faster. What kind of academy? Restoration, mechanical skills. Young people who don't have obvious paths into work that uses their hands and their brains at the same time. He paused. The kind of work your father did when he was 24. Before anyone would have called it a legacy, the silence on her end had a particular quality. He'd come to recognize Nicole Hargrove's silences the way you recognized the silences of anyone you'd spent concentrated time near. Each one's carrying different texture, saying different things. This one said she was thinking about her father in the Tulsa repair shop, about the 24-year-old who'd worked alone in a garage counting weeks until the second job covered what the first job didn't, about the line between that man and the one who'd built an empire and never quite figured out how to bring his daughter along. Send me the plans when you have them, she said finally. Why? Because the Hargrove Coal. The Hargrove Foundation has a workforce development program that's been running at about 40% of its potential. And because I think my father would have found that embarrassing. Brian looked at the car across the garage, at the curve. The specific radius that had started everything. He would have, he said, not guessing, knowing from 112 pages of a dead man's private record. She hung up. He stood in the garage for a while with the phone in his hand. Then he went inside and started the plans for the academy on the back of a grocery list, because it was what was available and it was how he'd always worked. From whatever was closest, making do with the materials present, rather than waiting for ideal conditions that never quite arrived. December moved through the way December moved in Portland, wet and dark, with brief intervals of a cold, clear quality that felt almost like a concession from the weather. Brian worked in the garage in the evenings, not on the car. The car was done, or done enough, the documentation complete, the authentication paperwork filed, the provenance chain reconstructed in the collaborative work of Brian's own file, and Sandra Callahan's archive research, and 3 separate institutional verifications that together produced a record, solid enough that no serious collector would have grounds for reasonable doubt. He told Gracie about the academy in December. In asking Mr. Davy Knoll, she had been asking about the money in the oblique but persistent way of 9-year-olds who had registered that something significant was happening, even though the adults around them had been conducting themselves with the specific casualness of people, trying not to make a big deal out of something. He told her they were going to make the garage bigger and teach people how to fix things. Gracie considered this. What kind of people? Young ones. People who need work and don't know how to get it yet. Like an internship. He was briefly stopped by this. Yes, like an internship. She appeared satisfied. Then, are we going to be rich? He thought about how to answer this. We're going to be okay. Which we already were, but more okay, some more okay. Yes. She processed this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Okay, she decided. But I still want scrambled eggs. He looked at her. The specific ordinary miracle of her, at this kitchen table in this house, with this particular brand of 9-year-old gravity. Scrambled eggs are not changing, he said. She appeared reassured. He found one photograph in his research during those December weeks, the result of a genuine effort to locate Carl Whitmore or any record of what had become of him. A birth record in rural Ohio, some professional filings from the 1970s and early 80s, the Missouri address that had stopped forwarding mail. After that, nothing. The kind of nothing that in a paper-based record era could mean many things, most of them ordinary, but the photograph he'd found, a man in his mid-40s, standing beside a workbench in what appeared to be a private workshop, smiling at whoever held the camera with the unself-conscious expression of someone who didn't know the picture was being kept for anything. Just a man in a moment, caught by someone who cared enough to keep it. Brian had it printed and framed in a simple dark frame and wrapped it in brown paper and set it in the back of his truck. He'd hang it when the academy space was ready. The explanation could come later. The right explanation for things usually could. January arrived with the specific quality of January in the Mountain West, which was cold and clear, and the particular altitude of Denver that made everything slightly more vivid, slightly more oxygen deliberate, the kind of air that reminded you it wasn't free. Brian drove. He drove because flying felt wrong for a trip he wanted to feel the distance of, wanted to arrive at with the sense of having traveled rather than having been transferred. Chevin came with him, which had been Kevin's idea, and which Brian hadn't argued with, because Kevin was good in situations that required someone to manage the logistics of existing in a place without getting tangled in the significance of why you were there. Kevin asked good practical questions. He found parking. He identified the coffee, a hotel lobby 3 blocks from the auction house, and described it as, quote, actually not bad, which was his highest available rating. Nicole was already at the auction house when they arrived. She stood near the registration desk with Stephen Delano, and a woman Brian didn't recognize who had the specific bearing of someone whose job was to know exactly what was happening at every moment and ensure all the moments happened correctly. Nicole was wearing something that was neither the jeans of the garage visits nor the formal register of the estate auction. Something in between, like someone who had found a way to occupy both versions of herself in the same outfit, which Brian thought was probably not accidental. She saw him across the room and did something with her expression that was not quite a smile but was in the family of one. A form of acknowledgement. He did the same. Kevin, at his elbow. That's her? That's her. Kevin evaluated this for a moment. She seems like a lot of work. She's getting better at it. Kevin made a sound that communicated skeptical neutrality and went to find more coffee. The pre-auction viewing had been open for 2 hours before the sale began, and Brian walked through it once, slowly, passing the car without stopping at it, looking at it from angles he hadn't seen before, in a room lit for presentation rather than work. It was strange. The same object he had crouched beside in the estate garage 6 months ago, the same object he had documented and measured, and spent hundreds of hours with in his own space. But in this room, under these lights, surrounded by the specific attention of people who understood what they were looking at, it was something that had been returned to the place it belonged. Not geographically, but categorically. A thing that had spent 40 years being hidden was being seen. The auction room filled with the particular efficiency of people who had cleared their schedules for a specific purpose and arrived ready to fulfill it. Brian had attended auctions before. Not of this scale or category, but he understood the architecture of the event, the way the room organized itself, around the object and the podium, the way collectors behaved differently from dealers, the way energy in a room shifted when the item that everyone actually came for was finally on the platform. The car went on the platform at 8 p.m. Under the lights designed for this, it looked different again. Still the same object. Still the dented fender and the faded badge and the specific curve that had started everything. But lit this way, documented this way, surrounded by the verified weight of what it was and where it had been and what its existence meant for a chapter of automotive history that had been considered closed. It had a presence that went beyond its physical dimensions. Brian sat in the row Nicole had indicated, 4 rows back from the front, on the aisle. She sat 2 seats away, Delano between them, which Brian suspected was deliberate on Nicole's part, a structural decision about what proximity meant and didn't mean in a room where everything was being observed. Kevin was in the back, near an exit. Having explained in the parking lot that auction rooms made him feel like any movement he made might accidentally cost someone money, and that he preferred to remain stationary for the duration. The bidding opened at $500,000, which was already the kind of number that reorganized the room's breathing. Not because anyone present couldn't accommodate that number, but because it established the floor, and the floor told you something about where the ceiling might be. And the ceiling was what everyone had come to find out. 700,000, 900,000. The increments were large. Every paddle that went up came from someone who had done the math beforehand and was doing it anyway. With the particular calm of people who had decided their number before they walked in and were not going to be moved by the room's energy. 1.2 million, the room thinned. Paddles went down and stayed down. Not concession exactly. The specific decision of knowing your number and respecting it. 2 million. 2.8. 3.5. Brian watched the car on the platform and did not think about the number. He thought about a cold garage floor in October, with a library book open in his lap and his hand not quite steady on the page. About the moment he'd understood what he might have found, and refused to let hope get ahead of evidence. About the months of careful, unglamorous, methodical work that followed and produced nothing but accuracy. About the person who had thrown the keys. Not with bitterness. He'd set that down a long time ago. He thought about it as the beginning of something. Humiliation as a doorway. Cruelty as an accidental gift. The most valuable thing he'd encountered in years had been handed to him as a joke. There was something in that worth keeping, though he still hadn't found the exact language for it. 5 million, 3 paddles still up. The room had gone quiet in the way. Large rooms went quiet when the thing they'd assembled to witness was actually happening. 5.7. 6 million. 2 paddles. Nicole's hands were in her lap. Still. She was watching the platform the way she'd watched the car in his garage on her first visit, with the quality of attention she had when she wasn't performing any register of herself for any audience. Her focus when she forgot to manage it. 6.8. 7 million. 7.4. 1 paddle. The room understood. The remaining bidder understood. The remaining bidder understood. And the room understood that he understood. And the particular silence that followed the 7.4 was the silence of everyone collectively registering that the transaction was about to complete. But it wasn't. A second paddle went up, from the left side of the room, 3 rows from the front. Lawrence Aldrich, 68 years old, who Brian had been briefed on by Sandra Callahan, in the tone of someone describing a credible force, collector, not speculator. A man who had been looking for this specific vehicle for 17 years, not because of investment value, but because he understood what it was and wanted it in the right hands, and believed his own hands were right. The 2 remaining bidders looked at each other across the room. Not dramatically. They were experienced people. They nodded, the way people nodded when they recognized a worthy counterpart across a significant distance. 7.8. 8. 8.4. 8.8. Slower now. Not uncertainty. Deliberation. The care of people very close to a number that mattered. 9 million. Aldrich's voice. Calm. The calm of someone who had decided what they were doing and was doing it. The auctioneer's voice repeated the number with the particular inflection of someone managing history. The room held. A long moment. A very long moment. The other paddle came down. The gavel $9 million. A record for a rediscovered prototype, which the room registered with the collective exhale of something large being set down after a long carry. Brian sat still in his chair, while the room erupted into the kind of applause that came from people who understood what they'd witnessed. Not loud for its own sake, sustained because the witnessing deserved it. He sat still for a long moment and let the room move around him. He looked at the car on the platform one last time at this distance. At the curve, the specific radius that had stopped him in a corner of an estate garage on an October night, when he had no reason to be stopped by anything. Moat. He thought about Carl Whitmore building 11 years of work into a single machine, and then handing that machine to a stranger, and disappearing from the record without ever confirming whether he knew what he'd left behind. He thought about what it meant to make something that mattered and never be there to see it matter. He had been living with a version of that understanding for 3 years in a different register, and it had not gotten easier, but it had gotten familiar, and familiar was its own kind of manageable. Nicole turned her head and looked at him. He looked back. She had the expression of someone who had arrived somewhere they'd needed to arrive, and found that the arriving was different from what they'd expected. Not worse. More actual. More present. The way significant things were always more actual than their anticipation. She said, quietly enough that only he could hear it across the 2 seats. He would have hated this room. Brian understood immediately. He would have loved knowing what it sold for, the smallest version of a laugh. Not joyful exactly. True, yes, he would have. Delano was already on his phone. The logistics of a $9 million transaction had their own momentum and their own timeline. And to Stephen, Delano understood that the moment after conclusion was also a professional moment. He moved discreetly away from their row toward the edge of the room, which left 2 seats of distance between Brian and Nicole Hargrove in a row that was emptying. Nicole looked at the platform where the car was being attended to by the auction house's handling team. "I'm restructuring the foundation's workforce programs," she said. Not a non sequitur. It followed from everything, if you'd been paying attention. "I'm renaming the skilled trades component. I wanted to name it after someone who represented what it's supposed to do. Someone who built things with their hands before they built anything else." Brian waited. "I was going to name it after my father," Nicole said. "The George Hargrove Workforce Initiative. Which is what the board suggested and what would have been the obvious choice. But I've been thinking about Carl Whitmore." She turned to look at Brian directly. "The man who made the thing that made all of this possible. Who handed it to a stranger and trusted that the world would eventually figure out what it was worth. Who didn't get to see any of this." Brian was quiet. "Is that right?" She asked it plainly, without the armor she usually used to frame her questions. "Or is it wrong in a way I'm not seeing?" He thought about the framed photograph in brown paper in his truck, waiting to be hung on a wall that wasn't built yet. He thought about the 4 words on the back of a photograph he'd found in a hidden compartment inside a car that nobody was supposed to find. "She doesn't know yet?" "Your father would have approved," he said. "He wrote about Whitmore in the notebook. Not much. But what he wrote, he understood that you don't own the things that change your life. You hold them for a while. And then they go where they need to go." Nicole held this. "Let it land." They left the auction house together with Kevin, which was not a plan and did not require acknowledgement. Just the natural geometry of 3 people heading toward the same exit at the same time. The January Denver air outside was the cold kind. The clear kind, the altitude kind that showed you the stars with a sharpness that cities with more moisture in their air didn't produce. Kevin looked up. "Can you actually see stars in Portland?" "Some nights," Brian said. Kevin appeared to be measuring something. "I grew up in a place where you could always see them." "I forgot about that." They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, all 3 of them, looking up at the January sky above a city none of them lived in, which was its own kind of clean. No obligation to this skyline. No history with these streets. Just the stars and the cold, and the fact of what had just happened in the building behind them. Nicole's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Made a small sound that was decision. "I have to take this." She stepped away, phone to her ear, voice low and carrying the specific cadence she used for business that was not small. Kevin watched her for a moment. Then, to Brian, without looking at him. "She's different from what you described." Brian hadn't described her. He'd answered Kevin's direct questions about her. When Kevin asked them, which Kevin did regularly with the certainty of someone who had decided he was owed information, commensurate with his involvement in the situation's physical logistics. "She's been different for a while," Brian said. "She's just more comfortable with it now." Kevin considered this. "That's a nice thing to say about someone who threw stuff at you." "She gave me the car. She threw the car at you." Semantics? Kevin made the sound of a man who had opinions about semantics. He looked back up at the stars. "You going to be okay? After all this?" "The car's gone." Brian thought about the framed photograph in brown paper in his truck, about the plans on the back of a grocery list. About a 9-year-old who had drawn a logo involving a corkscrew and a vintage automobile, and presented it with the authority of someone who had resolved a question without being asked. "I was okay before the car," he said. "You were okay in the way that a person can be okay and still be missing something." Brian looked at him. Kevin was staring at the sky, with the expression of a man who had said something more insightful than he'd intended, and was going to act like he hadn't until the moment passed. "When did you get perceptive?" Brian said. "I've always been perceptive. You just don't usually give me opportunities." Nicole came back. Phone in her pocket, the call resolved, her expression the one she wore after completing something necessary. She looked at both of them and registered the specific quality of the silence she'd stepped back into. I'm interrupting something. Kevin was being unexpectedly philosophical, Brian said. Kevin, with dignity. I am frequently philosophical. Nobody tracks it. Nicole looked at Kevin with the expression she'd been slowly developing since that first afternoon. She'd arrived at the garage, without calling ahead. The look that said she was encountering something she hadn't budgeted for, and was deciding to find it worthwhile rather than inconvenient. Thank you for the coffee, she said. Earlier, Kevin received this. Did something with it internally. You're welcome, he said, which was the same thing he'd said when he'd handed her the cup but with different infrastructure behind it now. They walked to the parking lot. Kevin to his truck, Brian to his, Nicole to her rental. The distance between the cars was ordinary. The circumstances weren't. At his truck, Brian opened the door and then stopped because she'd said his name, not his last name, his first, which she hadn't done before. He turned. She was standing between her car and the neighboring one with her keys in her hand and her breath visible in the cold Denver air. And she had the expression of someone who had arrived at the last available moment to say something and was deciding whether to use it. I have been trying to think of the right way to say this for about a month. He waited. You gave me my father back. Her voice was even. Completely even. The evenness of it was the most revealing thing about it, the amount of steadiness it cost to hold the voice that level. Not the version of him I thought I had. The real one. The one who kept a car for 30 years, because it reminded him of who he was before anyone was watching. She looked at him steadily. I didn't deserve that. I didn't deserve to have it come from you. But it did, and I want you to know that I know that. Brian stood with his hand on the truck door in the January cold. You earned it, he said finally. The knowing. You earned that part. The lawsuit? Yes. And the reading. And coming back, he paused. Showing up to things is underrated, she looked at him. At the quiet that was his natural register, which she'd spent enough time near now to understand was not absence. It was fullness. The particular fullness of someone who had been through enough to know what was worth filling space with and what wasn't. Sunday, she said. Sunday, Portland. The academy plans. A pause. Gracie has soccer in the morning. I know, he looked at her for a moment. At the specific achievement of someone who had listened carefully enough to remember the things that weren't about them. We're usually back by noon, he said. She nodded, got in her car. He got in his truck. Kevin was already pulling out of the lot. He honked once. The comfortable territorial honk of Kevin Tipton signaling departure, which, in 11 years of friendship, had come to mean something specific and untranslatable, and which Brian had never felt the need to translate. Brian followed Kevin out of the lot and pointed south toward the highway. Denver's lights behind him. Portland 700 miles ahead. The dark stretch of the mountain west at night between the two. He drove. He thought about a 9-year-old who needed scrambled eggs done right and took the distinction between 8 and 9 very seriously and had drawn a logo for an academy that wasn't built yet and seemed entirely unconcerned about the timeline. He thought about a photograph in brown paper waiting to be hung on a wall that was also not built yet. Carl Whitmore smiling at someone who cared enough to keep the image, a man who had made something extraordinary and handed it to a stranger and walked away into the documentary silence of a life that stopped leaving records. He thought about what it meant to hold something for a while and then let it go where it needed to go. He thought about George Hargrove writing by hand at 2 a.m. in a Tulsa repair shop, the first entry in a notebook he'd keep for 30 years, trying to put words to a feeling he didn't yet have language for. About a daughter who had spent 26 years thinking her father hadn't come to her third-grade play. About the way the truth of a thing and the perceived truth of a thing could exist in completely separate places for decades, and how sometimes all it took to close that distance was someone paying the right kind of attention. Brian had been paying attention his whole life. It was the thing he did, instead of many other things. It was the thing that had made him an engineer, and then made him a restorer, and had made him the kind of father who stood in a doorway long enough to make sure the breathing was the right kind, who took the toast out 30 seconds early, so the butter had time. It was the thing that had stopped him in front of a canvas tarp on an October night when every other person in that garage had walked past without looking. Paying attention was not a glamorous quality. It didn't produce headlines or recognition. It produced the kind of life where you knew things other people missed, where you found things other people overlooked, where you occasionally discovered that the most valuable object in a room full of wealthy people was sitting in the corner, under a dusty tarp, and that the person who'd been publicly humiliated for looking at it had simply been paying more attention than anyone else in the building. Kevin's taillights were 200 yards ahead, steady and known, the highway. The highway stretched. Stars overhead, the same stars they'd stood under in Denver, following him west at the speed the earth turned, indifferent to auctions and notebooks. And the small human machinery of secrets kept and secrets found, and what happened in the space between the keeping and the finding. Brian drove through the dark toward Portland, toward the garage that was going to become something larger than itself. Toward a 9-year-old who would ask him tomorrow morning, over soft scrambled eggs and toast, buttered all the way to the edges, whether the car had sold and for how much, and he would tell her the number and watch her face, try to process a sum that was genuinely beyond the architecture of a 9-year-old's reference points. And she would be quiet for a moment with this information. And then she would ask for more juice, and Brian would pour it, because that was the work, the actual work, everything else. The car, the notebook, the $9 million, the woman who was going to drive up from the airport on Sunday and sit across from him in a garage that smelled of oil and old rubber, and the accumulated honesty of machines, kept past the point where keeping them made obvious sense. All of it was important. None of it was more important than the ordinary day he was driving toward. Some things, when they were finally set down in the right place, stopped being mysteries. Not because they were explained, because they were complete. The explanation was never the point. The point was the completeness. The point was the arriving. He drove through the dark. 3:15 would come, the way it always came. He'd be there.